So part of what teachers like Eckhart Tolle and others have contributed is an orientation to awakening and to your life purpose that really is quite demanding. He's basically saying there is a dimension of your being, and forgive me if this doesn't seem like a fair summary, but I'll do my best. There's a dimension of your being that you don't perhaps know of yet, that is infinite or unboundaried and actually quite impersonal to the dimensions of yourself that you do know about, that are more personal, more local, your sense of me or ego. And Eckhart is from a long tradition of people who have basically said, if you want to live in true freedom, you've got to identify with that impersonal consciousness dimension of yourself, in part by disidentifying with who you've known yourself to be all along. That's the one that's causing all the problems, the ego, the me, the mind, constantly churning and revolving around me and my stuff and my relationships and what's happening with it, and how am I going to get enough money and blah, 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 blah.
Stories.
The story.
Mm-hmm.
You know, many teachers today now are focused on getting you to identify with the greater self or consciousness and to disidentify with your story, your past, your history, everything that you've been, everything that you're tending to keep kind of mechanically repeating, the tape loops going through your mind, all the stuff you've learned and heard and blah, 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 blah. Is everybody familiar with, is this all making sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Our orientation is you don't have to disidentify. In the context of a force field of transmission that more and more we've learned, we've seen over the years, sure enough, it has a kind of a, like the name of your cafe in town here, the 100th Monkey. There sure enough is a critical massing, whereas people tap into this kind of way of being together, we green light one another, Linda uses that phrase, hold one another, sometimes literally physically, but also in our spirit, in our heart presence. We hold one another, and we can actually make room for all of the parts of the ego. So you really see this? There's a picture of a heart here, and show and tell time. So this actually means a lot to me and to Linda, that it's within the context of the heart.
In the early days when I first started sitting with Saniel, I remember very distinctly him saying, I just want company, because he realized and founded this amazing communication. And at that time there were no others really speaking quite the way that Saniel was speaking about conscious embodiment, about the fact that you don't have to perfect the body-mind. You don't have to control the ego. You embrace all sides. And eventually people started popping. That's a word that's used in some communities that have awakenings. They awaken, and they embody their awakening, and then they transmit that force of being to others, and that is an activating force as well. So it was wonderful that in your early work, you had a vision of helping individuals pop, really land fully in their totality. It was beautiful. I'm glad you have a lot of company now.
Yeah, yeah, and it's been quite an adventure. It didn't just all roll itself out automatically. It's been an amazing journey to here. But yeah, that's the orientation I've always had. And so, just what Linda was saying, from the very earliest time, my orientation has been, well, it doesn't seem to me to be necessary for you to fight against your ego The local sense of me or self, everybody has it. For many of us feels a lot of the time very separate or confused about who I am, a sense that something's really missing right at the core of being, and don't know how to get there, don't know what it is. And our interpretation of that uneasiness is quite different from what has traditionally been proposed. Our orientation is that it's actually very natural for a simultaneously infinite and finite being. Just consider this for a moment. If you actually are both infinite and finite, wouldn't there be something uncomfortable about that? Ramana Maharshi, one of the great sages of India, who taught in a more traditional style about this, but was great. He started my heart awakening. I'll be grateful to him forever. And later in his life, he developed a kind of a palsy, a shaking. And one of his attendants was confused. He says, "Master, you're self-realized. I don't understand. Why would your body shake if you're a realized being?" Which is a bit of a naive understanding of what self-realization might entail. And Ramana Maharshi said to him, he says, if you try to stick an elephant in a hut, every now and again the tiles on the roof are going to shake. Your bigness, which you may not have accessed fully yet, and that's part of what we mean by radical conscious embodiment, your bigness will never fit completely here. It's a given. The simultaneity of infinite, unconditional, free-feeling being with material limitation is a burn.
Is a
burn. It burns. It stings. We call it a core wound. And early on in my work I figured out, you don't heal that sucker. You become conscious, not only of it, but as it. You become simultaneously that infinite field of being and this very mortal, finite ego, personal self, and also all of the ranges in between of the personal soul and its sense of expansion, but still very much you. And so in this process, rather than the goal of spiritual life to be to get out of life into, some of the great terminology from the East, liberation from the wheel of birth and death, so you don't have to come back here and be a poor, mortal, finite, deluded fool ego again. That's been the orientation, and we could talk at great length about how all that happened and how natural and necessary it was in human evolution. But it appears now that the human spirit, or the human force of being, the divinely human force of being, is figuring out, let's just say it that way, is getting, it's like it's changing direction. And so the great impulse becomes getting here. As all of this full radical conscious embodiment, not only of being. This is one of the places where we respectfully and gratefully and also firmly and forcefully would take issue with teachings that say to you, well, your life purpose really only pertains to your being nature, your God self, your infinite, impersonal consciousness. By not identifying with that local personal self and all his or her wants and needs and reactions and attachments and aversions and or what we call broken zones. We'll talk a little bit more about them as we go.